What if the fate of freedom rested not in the hands of generals, but in the hands of ordinary workers building machines thousands of miles from the battlefield? Imagine cities burning, families shattered, young pilots falling from the skies while the world held its breath. For years, Germany's Luftwaffe reigned supreme. Their fighters feared across Europe. They believed no rival could match their precision, their speed, their firepower. But they were wrong. Out of the smoke of despair, a machine rose. Not just an aircraft, but a message forged in steel rivets and endless streams of ammunition. The P-47 Thunderbolt was more than a fighter. It was America's declaration that industry, unity, and sheer willpower could shape the destiny of nations. This story begins in the spring of 1943. When the first P-47s took flight over occupied France. At first mocked as heavy and clumsy, the so-called flying milk bottle would soon prove unstoppable. Behind it stood not only brave pilots, but millions of American workers, many of them women, producing at a pace the world had never seen. This is the untold truth of how factories, not only battlefields, helped turn the tide of World War II. In the years following the First World War, the world staggered under economic depression, political turmoil, and the lingering scars of conflict. By the late 1930s, fascism had spread like a dark shadow across Europe. Adolf Hitler's Luftwaffe soared to prominence, its sleek Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs dominating the skies. Britain fought back with its Spitfires, agile but fragile. The United States, distant from the battle, had not yet revealed the industrial giant it was about to become. When America entered the conflict after Pearl Harbor, it faced a grim reality. The Luftwaffe was not just an opponent, it was a predator ruling the European sky. If bombers carrying the promise of liberation were to reach their targets in Germany, they needed guardians strong enough to withstand the fire of cannons and the terror of dogfights. Out of this desperate need, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was born. At first glance, it seemed absurd. Weighing nearly 13,000 pounds empty and more than 17,000 pounds fully loaded, it dwarfed every German fighter. British pilots sneered, calling it a flying milk bottle too heavy to fight. But Alexander Kartveli, the Georgian-born engineer behind its design, had a vision. He ignored European obsession with shaving grams of weight. Instead, he asked a different question. What if a fighter could carry more guns, more ammunition, more armor, and still survive? Kartveli's answer was radical. Mount 8 Browning 50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing. Equip the plane with heavy armor to protect the pilot. Add a massive engine, the Pratt & Whitney R-28 Double Wasp, with a turbo supercharger capable of maintaining power even at 30,000 feet. The result was not elegance. It was brute strength, a weaponized anvil designed to smash through the Luftwaffe's finesse. But vision on paper means little without proof in battle. The 4th Fighter Group, made up of American pilots who had once flown for the Royal Air Force as the famed Eagle Squadrons, received the Thunderbolt in early 1943. Transitioning from the nimble Spitfire to this behemoth was a painful process. Radios malfunctioned, engines coughed. The sheer weight made takeoffs hazardous. For weeks, missions ended in frustration. Pilots cursed the aircraft that seemed more liability than savior. Everything changed on April 15, 1943. Major Donald Blakeslee, gripping the control stick high over the French coast, spotted a Focke-Wulf 190 breaking through the clouds. In that instant, the test of Kartveli's vision became real. Blakeslee pressed the trigger. 8 guns roared, unleashing a storm of incendiary rounds at more than 6,000 bullets per minute. The German fighter, pride of the Luftwaffe, disintegrated in seconds. That kill was more than a victory. It was a revelation. The Thunderbolt was no clumsy milk bottle. It was a sky fortress, able to drown its enemies in a flood of fire. For the first time, American pilots felt the power of industrial democracy embodied in steel and lead. Word spread quickly. More missions followed. Though plagued by range limitations at first, the P-47 proved nearly indestructible in combat. It could take hits that would shred a Messerschmitt or a Focke-Wulf, yet still bring its pilot home. Pilots began to trust it, not only as a machine of war, but as a shield. One said, "You did not climb into a P-47. You strapped it on like armor." Behind every plane was a story not often told: the workers who built it. In the vast factories of Farmingdale, New York, and Evansville, Indiana, thousands labored around the clock. Many were women, stepping into roles once denied to them. They riveted metal, tested engines, and assembled weapons with precision that stunned German intelligence. For them, each bolt tightened was a promise to a son or a husband fighting overseas. By April 1943, Republic Aviation was producing a new P-47 every 4 hours. That rhythm, relentless and unstoppable, was America's answer to tyranny. Every new plane rolling off the assembly line was not just an aircraft, it was a symbol. A symbol that fascism could be overwhelmed not only by courage, but by capacity. Thus, the P-47 became more than a machine. It was a turning point, a statement written in steel. In the great struggle of the 20th century, the side that could build more, faster and stronger, would hold the skies. And in that realization lay the beginning of Germany's downfall. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not simply a fighter. It was the physical embodiment of America's industrial will. To understand its impact, one must step away from the dogfights over Europe and into the roaring factories of the United States. At Republic Aviation in Farmingdale, New York, assembly lines stretched farther than the eye could see. By mid-1943, a new Thunderbolt rolled out every 4 hours, a tempo Germany could scarcely comprehend. In Evansville, Indiana, another line matched this rhythm. Together, they poured hundreds of aircraft each month into the war effort. While German plants struggled to exceed 1,000 fighters of all types monthly, America was producing more than 400 Thunderbolts alone, on top of thousands of bombers and transports. But it was not just the aircraft. The real secret lay in ammunition. Each P-47 carried 8 machine guns, each with hundreds of rounds. A single squadron could unleash tens of thousands of bullets in one mission. The Lake City Army Ammunition Plant in Missouri supplied this hunger with a staggering capacity of 1.6 billion rounds annually. German analysts, upon capturing a Thunderbolt, were stunned not by its design, but by the fact that every component fit perfectly with any other of its type. Interchangeability was a standard Germany never achieved. Consider the mathematics of firepower. German fighters typically carried a few cannons with limited ammunition, forcing pilots to conserve every shell. A Luftwaffe squadron of 12 aircraft might enter battle with 7,000 rounds total. By contrast, a single P-47 squadron of 16 planes carried more than 44,000 rounds of heavy ammunition. American pilots often fired freely, expending 60% of their load in combat. On average, U.S. forces fired more rounds in one day over France than the entire Luftwaffe received in a week. This disparity shaped doctrine. German pilots trained to stalk, strike, and retreat with surgical bursts. They entered combat with barely a minute of firing time available. American pilots had 30 to 35 seconds of continuous fire, long enough to blanket an entire sky with bullets. They did not need perfect aim. They needed to point, press, and hold. As Lieutenant Colonel Francis "Gabby" Gabreski recalled, "We did not need to be better shots. We just had to keep our sights on them. The 850s did the rest." Training mirrored this abundance. American pilots typically logged 400 hours before combat, including 100 hours on gunnery practice. They had fired thousands of rounds at targets before facing an enemy. By late 1943, German recruits often entered combat with little more than 100 hours of total flight time and scarcely any live-fire training. Many Luftwaffe pilots had squeezed their triggers only a handful of times before being thrown against Allied veterans. Battlefields soon reflected this imbalance. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg raids revealed both strengths and weaknesses. Within the range of Thunderbolt escorts, German interceptors were shredded. The 56th Fighter Group alone claimed 17 victories in one mission without losing a man. Yet beyond the Thunderbolts' limited escort radius of roughly 375 miles, bombers became prey. 60. B-17 flying fortresses were lost in a single day when escorts were forced to turn back. This vulnerability led to innovation. Engineers developed external fuel tanks, first 75-gallon belly tanks, then 150-gallon drop tanks. Each extension pushed the Thunderbolt deeper into German skies. By late 1943, escorts could reach 425 miles from base. With each mile gained, the Luftwaffe was forced to fly farther, fight longer, and face the 850s under increasingly unfavorable conditions. Meanwhile, the role of the Thunderbolt expanded. Its firepower proved devastating not only in the air but against targets on the ground. A single attack run could reduce a train to twisted steel, locomotives exploding as armor-piercing incendiary rounds pierced their boilers. Vehicle columns disintegrated under waves of gunfire. By 1944, German commanders ordered rail movement only under cover of darkness, fearing the P-47's relentless interdiction. Beyond the statistics lay the human experience. In the skies, American pilots flew with confidence. They knew that even if their aircraft took damage, spare engines, propellers, and gun sets awaited at forward depots. A Thunderbolt crippled in the morning could return to battle within days. For German pilots, the reality was grim. Shortages forced them to cannibalize damaged planes for parts. Maintenance delays grounded entire squadrons. Even when airframes survived, the lack of fuel meant many stayed idle on the runway. Psychology became a weapon. The sight of 8 glowing tracer streams cutting through the sky terrified German aviators. On the ground, the whistle of diving Thunderbolts sent soldiers diving for cover. A weapon had become a symbol, a sound of inevitability, a reminder that America's factories were at war as much as its soldiers. This was the essence of America's wartime philosophy. Not perfection in small numbers, but adequacy in overwhelming abundance. The German approach pursued technical finesse at the cost of volume. The American approach trusted in numbers, reliability, and a supply chain that seemed infinite. In the great contest of World War II, this philosophy proved decisive. By the summer of 1944, the truth was undeniable. The Republic P-47, Thunderbolt, was no longer just a fighter. It had become a symbol of how war itself had changed. It was not only about bravery in the cockpit or brilliance in strategy. It was about numbers. Numbers of planes, numbers of bullets, numbers of hours worked in factories thousands of miles away. The battlefield of World War II was being reshaped by production lines as much as by front lines. Nowhere was this more evident than on June 6, 1944, D-Day. That morning, Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, supported by an aerial armada, unlike anything the world had ever seen. The P-47 flew more than 2,300 sorties that day, raining down destruction on German positions. 84 enemy aircraft were destroyed in the air, 89 more on the ground. But the true devastation came against supply lines. German vehicles, trains, and convoys were cut to pieces. Soldiers who survived the beaches later recalled the skies above. It was as if the earth itself roared with thunder every time the P-47s dove. While Luftwaffe pilots scrambled, their reality was crushing. At Normandy, the Germans managed barely 300 sorties. The Americans, by contrast, flew over 13,000. A German squadron might enter combat with only a few thousand rounds of ammunition. A single American group carried millions. The imbalance was so severe, the German commanders began warning their men not to engage Thunderbolts unless absolutely necessary. To do so was often suicide. The statistics tell the story. By war's end, the Thunderbolt was credited with nearly 4,000 enemy aircraft destroyed in the air, more than 3,200 destroyed on the ground, and staggering damage to German infrastructure: 9,000 locomotives, 86,000 railway cars, 68,000 motor vehicles, and 6,000 armored fighting vehicles. These numbers were not just victories. They were the collapse of an enemy's mobility, the slow strangulation of a war machine that could no longer move or resupply. For German pilots, the psychological weight was immense. They faced opponents who flew without fear of running out of fuel, who sprayed bullets without counting each round, who always had spare planes and spare parts waiting back at base. Meanwhile, their own lives were constrained by scarcity. They measured every burst of ammunition, worried about fuel for the return flight, and watched comrades fall month after month. By late 1944, Luftwaffe units suffered casualty rates of 50% every month. Few pilots lived long enough to become veterans. The imbalance reached absurd proportions. By 1945, some Focke-Wulfs flew with only 2 cannons instead of 4, simply because there was not enough ammunition to arm them fully. German jets like the Me-262 could achieve speed records, but they carried barely 300 rounds for their cannons, enough for only a handful of firing passes. Against bombers, this was dangerous. Against Thunderbolts, it was hopeless. American abundance also changed the rhythm of combat. Pilots rotated home after 25, then 35, and finally 50 missions. They went back to train others, carrying hard-earned lessons with them. German pilots flew until death, capture, or permanent injury. There was no rotation, no relief, only exhaustion and despair. And yet, perhaps, the most extraordinary dimension of the Thunderbolt's success was that it was not won solely in the skies. It was built in the hands of millions of Americans on the ground. At the Republic Aviation Plant, women made up 40% of the workforce by 1943. They riveted, welded, and inspected with precision. At Lake City, mostly women served as quality control inspectors, rejecting ammunition if it varied even 1,000th of an inch from specifications. Their unseen dedication ensured that, when a pilot pressed the trigger, his guns never failed. This human element became the soul of industrial warfare. Every rivet fastened by a factory worker, every round stamped and inspected, was as much a weapon as the plane itself. Unlike Germany, where slave labor and shortages led to sabotage and poor quality, America's workforce was motivated, skilled, and determined. The difference showed in every engagement. By 1944, the Thunderbolt had reached new forms. The D-25 introduced a bubble canopy for greater visibility, a paddle blade propeller for improved performance, and even rocket provisions. Later, the P-47N carried internal fuel loads larger than some German medium bombers, giving it the range to operate in the vast Pacific. It was proof that American engineers, backed by industry, could push limits that seemed impossible. In the end, the P-47 did not simply outfight its enemy. It outproduced, outlasted, and outthought them. It transformed the philosophy of war from individual skill to collective might. Each burst of its 850s was not just a spray of bullets, but a declaration. America's factories were awake, and they would not sleep until fascism was crushed. This was the lesson of abundance. In war, courage is vital, but courage without resources dies quickly. The P-47 showed the world that victory belongs not only to the brave, but to the nation that can sustain its bravery with endless supplies. This was the true revolution of World War II, the shift from battles of maneuver to battles of production, where the winner was the side that could build, supply, and maintain the fight without pause. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt is not simply a tale of machines or of pilots. It is the story of an idea, the belief that freedom can be defended not only by the courage of soldiers, but by the determination of an entire nation. In World War II, the battlefield stretched far beyond Europe and the Pacific. It reached into factories, farms, and households across America. Every worker tightening bolts, every inspector rejecting a flawed round, every farmer producing food for millions was part of this victory. The Thunderbolt became a symbol of that unity. It stood for an America that refused to bow to tyranny, that answered bombs with industry, and that turned the strength of its people into wings of steel. More than 3,000 enemy aircraft destroyed on the ground, nearly 4,000 in the air, tens of thousands of vehicles, and locomotives reduced to wreckage. These were not just statistics. They were the proof that fascism could be beaten when freedom armed itself with resolve and abundance. Today, the roar of the Thunderbolt is silent, but its lesson remains. World War II showed us that liberty requires more than words. It demands sacrifice, unity, and the will to build for a future worth defending. If ordinary Americans, men and women, young and old, could join hands to outproduce and outfight one of the most powerful regimes in history, then what excuse do we have to remain silent in the face of injustice today? The legacy of World War II reminds us that peace is fragile, that independence must be guarded, and that justice must be pursued with unwavering strength. We may no longer face dogfights over Europe, but the battle for freedom continues in new forms around the world. The question is not whether the fight will come. It is whether we will be ready to answer. So I leave you with this. Will you stand with those who once chose courage over fear, unity over division, freedom over oppression? Will you be part of a new generation that fights not with bullets, but with voices, not with bombs, but with truth? The world cannot afford our silence. If this story has touched your heart, share it, speak it, and carry it forward. Because the greatest victory of World War II was not only that fascism was defeated, it was that ordinary people proved that when united, they could shape the destiny of nations.